naughty, you
I'm
can
sure
try
it's
to
not
walk
right
up
too.
here and just quietly let them in and tell them to keep their mouth shut.
Should be on. I'll double check on my screen.
Part of the fun, I guess. Spontaneity with people who cross in front of you.
Set falls over.
Yeah. You just keep talking.
Wait for Paul's confirmation. Somebody popping. Oh, hey, Barrett. Oh. Okay, so I think we're live, and welcome everyone. My name is Sean Barnes. I am the gallery coordinator and director at the Leonor R. Fuller Gallery at the Kenneth J. Minart Center for the Arts here at South Puget Sound Community College. And this is the first installment of artist talks for the 2022 Southwest Washington Regional Juried Exhibition. Our guest juror this year was Arendon Jarink. Before I begin, I just would like to remind everyone that we are on tribal land and that SPSEC sits on the ancestral lands of the Stachos Band of the Squaxin Indian tribe and the Nisqually Indian tribe, who have long been stewards of the region's waters, plants, and animals. The southernmost point of the Salish Sea, these lands were and still are a place of gathering, trade, and community for many Coast Salish peoples. We recognize that all who are not Salish peoples are visitors here. We commit to join these peoples to share their history, build relationships, increase representation, and restore the living world around us. So tonight, I have the pleasure of visiting with Becky Frehse, Janice Lyons, and Judith Smith. And they are three artists that are in this year's juried exhibition. Becky Frehse is a Tacoma artist and mixed media painter and assemblage artist whose work includes painting, drawing, site-specific installations, and sculptural artist books with found objects. Janice Lyons is an an artist, a graphic designer, and abstract painter working in acrylic and multimedia. And Judith Smith, also an Olympia artist, printmaker, neon and found object sculptor, and is now working in pastels and encaustic. So welcome this evening. Thank you for taking the time to be here. So just a little bit about how the evening breaks down. We'll do some questions and conversation with the artists till about 6:40, 6:45, something like that. And just see how the time goes. And then we'll open up questions to the gallery. And so if any of you or all of you have questions for the artists, we'll open up that conversation. Okay, so, well, all right, well, I will begin. So I have a series of questions here that I kind of draw from, and a lot of times I think a nice way to kind of break the ice is to just talk about process. And so I'm gonna open up a question to all three of you. And just with regards to painting, how does a painting begin for you? Like, do you have a ritual of making? How do you start a painting? And any of you could start. And
I have no ritual, therefore that opens it for the other two. I begin with inspiration, but I have no ritual, so if you want to address
that's a start for sure. Yeah. What is the inspiration?
It could be anything. It could be from books, from poetry, from music, personal experiences in nature, and even sometimes just cleaning the studio gives you a spark. And you are looking at certain colors in your pastel boxes and you think, that looks really good next to each other and I haven't noticed that before. And then you kind of evolve into something. And I was actually painting the basement stairwell the other day. And sounds silly, but it's true. This is a very old house that I live in. It's like 110 years old. And the walls of the basement stairwell because we had a leak in a hot water heater, and that's a long story, or bumped out from many, many different iterations of repair with concrete. And as I was painting this, I was looking at the concrete forms, and I was seeing a face, and, and I thought, oh no, I'm doing that again. But it gave me an inspiration, and later that afternoon, I went out to the studio and I started fooling around with charcoal, and next thing I knew, I had incorporated that bumpy thing on the wall into an abstract painting. So I wonder if the rest of you have exciting experiences like that.
That seems like a ritual.
No, it's not a ritual.
Cleaning the studio?
Well, it's a haphazard clean in my studio. It's
yeah.
not, all lined up perfectly.
There's the activity and the movement and moving and organizing and looking at the colors, kind of a divination of sorts, maybe.
All right, I'll give you that. Everything except the word organization.
Okay.
You may add.
My studio, too. Yeah. How about you, Becky?
I don't know if I have a ritual, but I guess it is, because I mix a lot of color, and it takes a while. And I almost always start with acrylic paint, which I hate, because I hate the way it dries plasticky looking sometimes. And it dries so fast, so you have to, play around to get it to do what you want it to do. And yeah, so there's quite a bit of time that it's really a lot about the color. But I have an idea or a notion when I start, and it's a long process. I paint kind of slow, although I like to make it look like it happened fast and spontaneously, but I stop and look a lot, and I listen to the painting. It's really a conversation, and so I have this notion, but sometimes the painting wants to go a different way. And so the next day I might come in and make a totally new decision and mix different colors and go a different way. But so most days are like that. I don't clean very much either, because why bother? It's a waste of time.
That's very true.
And I just throw stuff in the sink, and when you need it again, grab it. But I hate to admit it, I guess. I have a dear friend who comes over once in a while and says, oh, clean your studio. She doesn't even want to come in there. And you know who you are.
Well, my studio is a mess as well. But as far as ritual, I guess the first step for me is just getting the courage to walk in the studio, because I'm new to painting, and so a lot of times I feel like I could go in there and totally fail. But it wasn't until recently that I realized it doesn't matter. I can paint over it and start again, But I always underpaint. I try to create some depth that way. And it's, the inspiration comes in these particular paintings was the death of my sister, which happened in January, and it was very sudden. And so these two particular paintings happened right after that. And so that was my inspiration. So sometimes it is a life event, and other times it is something from a poem or a book I've read or a story someone's told me.
I think most artists paint from life events like that, things that really move us or shake us. I had the similar experience, lost my son to suicide, and it engendered an interesting escape from life for me for a while in painting. And I did a series on loss, and they had my ubiquitous black bird in them, because I'm sort of known for crows and ravens, and I used that as a metaphor all the way through this particular series. And I showed it in 2 places, and I sold every one but one, which was amazing to me, because they were about me, about something that was very shaking in my life. And yet the people that bought them were people who stood in front of them for a long time, apparently. I asked the gallery people about this, and then said, I have to have this, and bought it. And I thought, wow. Of course, they were birds, but they were, to me, they were specific. But to the people buying them, they saw something in them that engendered the same emotional response And I think that's typical of most artists, no matter what your particular sorrow is or your particular joy. If you express it in your art, people will see it and buy it for their own reasons, enjoy it for their own reasons, even if they don't buy it. Hopefully they'll buy it.
That's always nice.
Yeah, and I guess that's where the question was coming from. The ritual was more of an example, but I think that where the place where it comes from and how that can be conveyed goes through a process, and it has its origins, and it stems from something, and that's kind of where what I was curious about with you all is because we don't often get specific in artist statements, and it's rarely, if ever, clear in the work, like on the surface, like, because I know in my own work sometimes it can be the piece just falls off the easel, or I step on it, or there is a mistake, or something comes through from the material, or major life events. There was a period of time, and one of the reasons why my work is still very dark is because of that, things in life just working their way in. But I appreciate what you say about that kind of, there's a kind of honesty that can come through that resonates with other folks. And I think your work, all of you, your work that's in the show is coming from that honest place and a very real place. Just for those of you that are in the gallery and you're not familiar with the show or have been online, over here on the left, this large painting, the first painting when you enter the gallery on the left, is by Becky Frehse. This is Becky. And if you look to the back of the gallery, on the back wall to the left of the leaves and to the right of the chickens, that's Judith's painting there. And then over here on the right, to the left of the large flowers, these two abstractions, one of them has the clock. Those are Janice's paintings, just to orient you into the space. Do you all have anything else to add to how things begin?
I have one small thing about talking about the dark place that some art comes from. Without the dark, you don't have the light. And chiaroscuro is a very important part of art, all the way through art history, starting with Caravaggio and coming forward to people like Leonard Baskin and a few others of my favorites like Rick Bartow, people like that. So the dark is there in all of us, and so is the light. It shows in our paintings.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go on to another question. I'm going to just go down my list. These were fun questions to come up with, just looking at the work that you submitted and looking at your statements. Thank you. And looking at your statements. And I haven't had a chance to go through everyone's website. I was talking to Judith about this, but there are things that resonated with me looking at your work, and all three of you are painters, and Judith painting with pastel, which is a drawing material traditionally, but it can have that quality. But thinking about painting and landscape or designed spaces or even visualized or imagined spaces, can evoke an emotional connection to a place and a time, and we already kind of tapping into that. But how do you arrive at or create a sense of place from that space, either from a two-dimensional space or for some remembered experience?
And this painting was part of a series called Tone Poems, and I borrowed that. My husband's a classical composer, and I live with a lot of musical language in my life and music, and I don't even read music. I can't play a thing. I'm pretty good on the harmonica, I guess, I'm told. But anyway, I've been, I was working on a series of pieces that involved putting musical staff lines in the original gesso layers, just and then using that and sort of building a lexicon. And I was working completely abstractly with just little bundles of shapes that would appear and disappear. And it was like reading, you know, from top to bottom. And tones would change. And I was in my mind and in my, you know, thinking about developing the space. It was all just abstract space with these lines and all this fun stuff and color and junk that I would put in there and add to the paint. And I was working in that way, and then I got a show at Green River College that I proposed these tone poems. And so suddenly I had a room like this that I had to fill. So, you know, boy, I had a crank, you know, but then COVID hit, and I moved my studio home to my old garage studio, and I started spending more time in my garden. And I have two little ponds. One has an electric pump so that we have a nice little gurgling stream, and the other one is just a plastic tub with various plants that I put in there and try to get to grow. And I've just always been fascinated by the water, and I started drawing from the ponds and drawing botanical stuff, and the next thing I knew, it was spring, and then it was summer, and then it was fall, and then it was winter again. And I didn't really think about it as, I wasn't planning to paint landscapes. And most of the tone poems are not, they don't use linear perspective or distant horizons or anything like that, but it's fascinating, it's endlessly fascinating to me how pictorial space can be construed and conjured and shifted and molded, and then, you know, yeah, it's what we do. If you're gonna paint, if you're gonna smear colored stuff on a flat surface, what are you doing? You're creating space. And, you know, you've got a figure and a ground usually of some kind. If you make a mark, you've got a figure, and now you've got a ground.
Can you tell us something about, I've seen some of your work where you've incorporated the strings from a cello and some other things. Can you talk a little bit about how you are dealing with collage, and are you going in that direction?
Oh, I'm a found object girl. I just got back from London last week, and I went for family reasons, but I go often, and Cornelia Parker has an exhibit at the Tate Britain that I wanted to see. She's, to me, the queen of the found object. And she had, 4 different huge installations there. And so I'm now full, but she had some ideas. I did a piece, an installation last winter in Tacoma that was called Soaring, but it had flying not tubas, trombones. And I've been wanting to flatten them, you know, and a musician friend of mine said, oh, it's easy, it's such soft metal, you can just run over it with your car. But I want to wait until my car is really dead before I do that, because I, you know, well, anyway, Cornelia Parker had a room this size, and she had brass instruments that went around in a circle with light bulbs, just simple, you know, regular lighting on the top, and it was like a symphony or a brass band flying all the shadows around the room, and I'm sort of tingling remembering it. And so I don't know how I'm ever going to live up to that, but I mean, she's Cornelia Parker, you got to look her up. And so stuff in the paint, yeah. You know, that's the best part. Do you ever, when you're painting, if you use jars of acrylic paint, I don't mean to hog the microphone.
No, please hog it.
I mean, you know, if you work with acrylic paint, well, even with oil paint, but, you know, a lot of times you get a larger quantity in a jar, and after it's about half empty, it'll start to get too thick and dry, and, you know, you got to throw some saran wrap in there and try to keep it wet. Well, sometimes I go for the jar, and it's like really drying, and it's sticky, you know. So at that point, you can just take it out with your hand and smear it on your canvas and it's like the best glue ever.
Now you're
And
talking encaustic, you realize that.
So, maybe, but I don't know, I don't.
We talked about that
Yeah,
in
we
the
talked
hall.
about it in the hallway, but I'm not, my studio is 100 and some years old and full of wood, and I'm not gonna have a burner up there. But anyway, no, maybe I'll try it sometime. Anyway, you can, that's one of my favorite things. So there's a piece on my website called Low Tide, and it's full of, it's got like, it's all about the detritus that gets left behind at low tide, but it's really colorful and I think fun. But there's like cigarette butts in there and cigarette wrappers and just stuff, you know, the best stuff. You once you're, especially if you're traveling, you know, you empty your pockets out at the end of the day and you throw them in a special spot, and that's, you know, good stuff for the next
You
time.
really need to try encaustic.
Okay, I'll be over. Somebody else talk about some silly thing that they do in their work.
Janice?
Well, I don't know. I haven't tried a lot of found objects, but I, you know, being a graphic designer for so many years, I do print out whatever I want to say in type, different type fonts, and rip it up. And a lot of times it's under several layers of paint. And there are some dried paint. One thing I found that I like to use is the tops of, you know, when your paint's dried out in your tube, there's a little thing. Yeah, and so sometimes I just need a pop of color. I'll just peel one of those off and stick it on some of the wet paint. And so I started using those almost in all my paintings because I've always got that around. But I'm going to try the found objects. I haven't tried that yet.
Just a little more, higher release.
Yes, yes.
And then I think if you coat them, with gel,
Yes.
you can preserve them.
Yeah.
I was a little worried about the cigarette
Yeah,
butts
we put that over
losing
the top.
their, you know, decomposing. I think all those things are going to last longer than we do because there's so much plastic in that paint, you know.
Well, now can we talk about encaustic?
Yes.
The piece I have in this show is not encaustic, but I can say a couple of words about it. It's not a dark piece, and it's not from any kind of sad event. It's called The Waiting Game, and it came to me an idea of some kids were lying around in the grass in front of this house one day when I went by, and I looked at them and I thought, you know what they're doing? They're waiting to grow up. They're waiting around to be grown-ups. Everything is a waiting game. We wait to be born. We wait to grow up. We wait to go to school. We wait to go to college. We wait to go to get a job. We wait to find someone to fall in love with. And we wait to die eventually. So that's really what that painting is about. And Sean asked about something, I can't remember the question now, but my answer would have been about form. I usually put some kind of recognizable form in my paintings. Some people have said that my work looks a little bit like German Expressionism. It's not what I started out to be, but it's kind of the way things happen in my paintings. And I'll start with a form that people recognize. It's often the eye of a bird or a wing or something that you've seen before as an avenue or a chance to enter the painting or find some point of starting to understand the painting. And it doesn't really matter what I have put into it for myself. It matters what you take out of it. So I did have one person say to me, "Is the front figure skiing?" And no, he isn't skiing. But he has passed through, or probably has passed through, that panel that you see. That could be transparent, or it could be not transparent. It could be a block for the other figure. It's up to you to decide. But enough of that. I want to talk about encaustic for just a minute until Sean takes away the microphone. Because both of these ladies could do fantastic encaustics if they wanted to. Encaustic is a wonderful new plaything for me. I discovered that I love the smell of beeswax, and
Yeah, could you talk about what encaustic is? Because
Yes,
many
sure,
people
I
wouldn't
will.
know what the material
It's
is.
beeswax, basically, impregnated with pure pigment. And often the pigment that I use is coming from my pastels. I take a regular cheese grater and I grate a pastel into the liquid beeswax. And I use a pancake griddle for my palette.
Like what you make your breakfast with, the slick
Not the same one.
griddle.
but
Not
yeah.
the same one, yeah, of course.
And I have a number of leftover sunbeam frying pans from the Goodwill store. And so I have all these different colors going at one time. And it's fascinating to paint this way because you really have to be fast. Becky was just saying that she approaches painting as in a slow way, and I'm probably the opposite. I paint very quickly, whatever medium I'm using. My favorite artist is Franz Klein, so you have an idea of how fast I paint. When I'm using the encaustic, I have to move from the griddle with my brush onto whatever my substrate is. It's usually door skin or chalk clayboard, something rigid. It can't be canvas. I will take a piece of loose canvas afterwards and press it down on my griddle to pick up the remaining paint, and then I have a really abstract piece when I pull that up. So there are a lot of fun ways to use encaustic, and one of the ways that I've had a lot of fun with was pushing things into it. The way Becky was talking about using the acrylic paint, I take objects from the beach. I use that. I've put all kinds of things into it. But the most recently, I took one of my husband's bicycle gears. He's a cyclist, and he has all these parts lying around all the time. So I found one in the wastebasket, and it was a really lovely big gear. And I pressed it into quite a bit of wax to hold that, and then a few other little things. And then I went over it with some other colors, and it made a very interesting abstract piece. And I also used it for underwater things. I do a lot of underwater painting, not underwater, above water, but of underwater themes. And I found that I will do a drawing on Japanese silk tissue with colored pencils because they're a form of wax. They're just very hard. And I'll do a detailed drawing of a fish or part of a fish or a little bit, and I will float that in wax. And the tissue disappears, and the painting is there floating in the wax, which I have colored with different blues and greens, and it looks as though the fish is really underwater. Anyway, it's on my website, but I'm taking too much time. Somebody else. Now you're all going to try encaustic. Yes. Even Sean, maybe.
I've never worked with encaustic, but I also enjoy working with found object assemblage, and I think that's, you know, you mentioned form, and whether we're creating the illusion of a form in that pictorial space, or, you know, bringing an object in, there's a history that we attach to those forms, right? And the thing about found objects that I think is pretty fascinating, and that I like to tap into, is the history of that object, you know. And I often, you know, I talk to my students a lot about an object stares back at us. It comes with this history, and it informs. And sometimes, you know, folks might think of it as like, you know, an easy way to add meaning to an image, but it deepens it in some way, and it becomes, you know, and then color and the object as brushstroke or shape. And so then there's this exchange between a real physical object and something that's alluded to or referenced through mark and stroke. It's cool. It's like magic. Yeah. Cool. Anything else about place and stuff?
Place and space. We could talk about that.
Place and space, yeah. Are you all familiar with Yi-Fu Tuan, the writer Yi-Fu Tuan? He has a book called Place and Space, and it's he talks about how we construct a sense of place from space, and that can be through through the four walls of a building space or a landscape space or a home space and family. But anyway, it's good stuff. You should check out Yi Fu Tuan. Anyway, speaking of spaces, all three of you share a sense of ambiguous space, right? Space that implies a depth and a flatness, and sometimes can be a disorienting space to a certain degree. And so I'm just wondering, a space like this that can either orient us in the painting in a sense of reality outside of the painting, or help to guide the viewer into an imagined or felt space. So I'm wondering what's behind or under the surface, for example, in your paintings, like embedded meanings that are in your work that aren't literal, that we're not seeing spelled out on the surface. And you kind of alluded to that a little bit, Judith, with your work.
In that particular painting, yes.
Yeah, and how does ambiguous space help you to communicate those things, or if that makes sense?
Well, I'm trying to find the right words for this.
As opposed to like a perspective space or a real space, like in a photograph or something.
Yeah. Well, any object or landscape or whatever the reference is that an artist looks at, the artist's vision turns it into a material reality of its own. So I try to give people a form or something to, a starting point to get into the painting. And I try to give it a bit of a base. I don't want them just swimming around in air. So you give them something they recognize. Like when I look at Becky's painting, I recognize those flowers, but they're in a totally new atmosphere for me. And when I look at Janice's, well, I know what a clock looks like. And so that's a way to start into that abstract. Look for the forms first. So I think in all three of our paintings, we've given a baseline for the viewer. So that's kind of a grounding in open space. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next.
Well, mine's pretty literal.
You sure?
Oh, mine's pretty literal, the clock painting anyway. And my intention was to do a portrait of my sister who had passed. And I started out, because I've done portraits in the past, a lot of portraiture, and I had read recently the quote that was attributed to Buddha, "The trouble is you think you have time," and it just came into my head. And I was just playing with paint, and the circular shape came out, and it looked like a clock to me. And being a graphic designer, I kind of had to design. I kind of had to separate the spaces, and then I wasn't sure how else to. I wanted that quote in there somewhere, and I could have printed it out on paper, and I could have hidden it underneath some paint. But I also wanted some white, a splash of white down there, and I wanted the viewer to be able to read that quote, I guess. So mine's pretty literal.
What is the quote?
The trouble is you think you have time.
That is.
Mm-hmm. And it was more or less to remind myself that, you can go at any time and to make the best use of the time you have. And so,
Yeah, when thinking about space, because I'm thinking about that, I love thinking about pictorial space because I'm constantly trying to figure it out. But one of the things is the horizontal line. Like I'm looking at two of Janice's paintings, and you guys can see them too. And so she's divided the space with a straight line. And then in Judith's piece, there's some diagonal lines which always send us back in space. A diagonal will just, do jets for space, right? And then with mine, we've got these all these lines, these horizontal lines, they appear and disappear, but they're there for a different reason. In some ways, they function almost like water rivulets. You know, and for me, it's just part of my vocabulary of thinking about composing. You know, I mean, both musically and, of course, graphically, and yet I avoid a horizon. I mean, I think I painted a horizon recently for another exhibit that I'm in, and it was so strange to me to divide the canvas with sort of an upper and a lower space that was so marked, so divided. So something I'm just wrestling with in my mind. But the other thing that I bring to the idea of landscape space and pictorial space is that I like to show in one picture plane that you're looking down and you're gradually looking up. And I feel, I strive for that in all of the pieces that have something to do with the natural world. And so this one is much closer, you know, we're looking at just a cross-section of space, but I think it still does that, where we're looking down at where our feet would be, and then gradually looking up. And I studied Chinese painting for quite a while, traditional Chinese painting, and studied in China, and I love traditional Chinese painting, absolutely love. And the way that they deal with space is so incredible and so symbolic, and yet can be so deep, and the far away nearby kind of thing. And so that does always come into my thinking when I'm building a space, when a pictorial space is trying to not just give you one point of view, but several, at least that up and down feel.
I had an interesting experience talking about the Chinese art influence the night of the opening. I was standing apart from my painting because I like to overhear, if I can, what people are saying. You never get a chance to do that. You can't get close enough. But I was watching two young Asian men taking photographs of my painting. And I thought, that's really nice, I think. And I walked over and touched the young man on the shoulder, and I said, "Thank you for taking a photograph of my painting. It must mean you like it, or you must be, you know, appreciating it." And he said, "Well, I'm just a student," he said, "but my father is an art professor." He didn't say where. And he said, "So I've studied some, and your painting reminds me of Chinese classical painting." And I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "It does." And he said, have you studied Asian art? And I said, "Well, I've been heavily influenced in the past by artists who have been heavily influenced by Japanese woodcuts and things." And so I said, "Yes, there is some of that, and I've traveled a lot in Asia." And I said, "So probably it's there, you know, under the surface." And I was very flattered that he took the painting. And then a little later, I saw them back there, and the other boy was taking pictures. So this is a win-win.
Yeah, and I think Becky, when you mentioned the difference between how the space is divided and how that can instruct the viewer and especially the artist, you know, to what the next move is going to be, and sometimes that can be, you know, depending on how you're handling it, it can be a literal space, especially because of our tendency to read that horizon line. And like that this will be above and this will be below. But then the way the horizon, or the way that horizontal line's used in Janice's work, it's like it becomes these flat spaces, and it's more of a dividing that space. But then it brings us back to the flatness of the canvas, and that space is ambiguous. That flat space is like it's not so literal, and it allows us to add and subtract and to have a little bit of depth or flatness and allude to different things. So, but I feel you with the horizontal line. It's like as soon as I bring a horizontal line into my landscapes too, it's like, uh-oh. Uh-oh, now I only have 2 ways to go.
Do I have to commit?
Yeah, do I have to commit to that? And yeah.
I'm also from the Midwest. I was raised in Illinois, and my grandparents. Oh wow, yeah, in the Midwest, and my grandparents were farmers, and cornfields for as far as you can see, and so I think it's ingrained in me this sense of there's sky and there's ground. And you can follow the Dutch painters and either have a really low horizon or a really high one, depending on what you want to focus on. But I think it's just something in there that I don't know why. I think probably it's nagging me enough that I'm going to have to do a whole series maybe about corn. They always used to call me a corn maiden. I think maybe I'm going to have to do cornfields. I don't know, but that line. And yeah, I'm kind of getting past the score lines being there because they're really hard to juggle and leap over, and sometimes it's not worth the trouble. But we'll see. Maybe I'm going to move on and have more horizons. I don't know.
Well, where I grew up, I grew up in the Ozarks, and so for me, it's that disorienting space. And Missouri's a cave state. So we were always spelunking, and it's 3-tier canopy and rocks and vertical spaces, and a lot of dark spaces. And so I'm at home in when I'm disoriented, or if I don't know what up, I kind of have this internal compass, I guess. But also that grounding experience of the horizontal line is destabilizing for me. It's like I can't stand it. It's too much order. Just a horizontal line. But anyway, yeah. Let's see. I'm gonna look at the time here where we're at. Okay, we're at 6:41. I've got a whole bunch more questions. Do you guys have questions? Do you all have any questions for each other? I
think we asked them in the hall.
You guys already talked about it. What were one of the questions that you asked each other in the hall? What?
That was a long time ago. It was just about Encaustic and oh, I know, the water mixable. You asked me about oil paint.
Water mixable.
Because I do. I move on to oil because it's so much more beautiful and luscious, and it stays open long enough that I can make a decision. So some of my students were working with water mixable oil paint, and I hadn't used it, so I finally decided I better get some and try it so I could figure out how it works. And so that painting has water mixable oil paint, and it's not bad. It has a color shift. Unfortunately, which is one of the reasons I like oil paint, is it doesn't shift like acrylic paint does. Mm-hmm. And I discovered that putting more water in, using water as a medium, isn't a good idea because there's more shift. And I didn't like the viscosity, but it's great for cleaning up because my arms are always filthy with paint, and you can just walk over to the sink and scrub it off. It's great for that. But and then I don't know if you're a techie like me. I'm a real materials nut. It's all about the materials. There's a medium made by a German company called Schminke, and they make a medium that you can use either with regular oil or water. And so it's a little bit expensive, but it's really great, so that if I grab a tube that's just regular oil that's not water mixable and it has to be that color, I know that I can soup it up with this Schminke and so you figure it out. Yeah. And it's, I don't know, I'm not going to stick with the water mixable, but it was good practice. Anybody here use water mixable? I saw somebody. Oh yeah. How about you? Have you tried it?
Well, Schmincke's a great company. That's my
Yeah.
favorite pastel company.
Oh, okay.
And we have the same problem in pastel with, keeping your color true, because normally we have to spray our work. And I never have done that because I was very upset in the beginning when the color started changing. Yeah. So I've always pressed the glass right up against the pastel, which is a no-no, but I've never had trouble with it. And I've always been happier with the end result than if I'd sprayed something and put a divider, a separator in there. But yeah, I didn't know Schmincke made that particular product that you're talking about, but that's interesting. Yeah. It works. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll open it up to the gallery now. And does anybody have any questions for the artists at all? Okay.
Nothing?
All right.
Nothing?
Go ahead. Hey, Sandra.
Right. Thank you. This is so inspirational, listening to you. I'm an artist as well. And I've just decided that I want to go into my pain side, my dark side. I want to bring that out. I want to paint that. I paint faces. So my question to you is it really relative to use dark colors to express dark emotions or pain? And how does an artist really take an emotion and work with that emotion on that two-dimensional canvas?
Those are big questions.
I have one answer, but then you can. When I talked about that group of paintings I did about loss, I used bright colors. I didn't use dark colors. I remember one particular crow shape, an abstracted crow shape, was lime green, and he was flying into a brilliant sky. But I also had torn the paper in the shape of a hole, in the shape of a sun. I had torn that piece out of the paper, and I had black paper behind it. So you had a brilliant picture with this black hole. In another one, I had two crows standing with, and they were purple. They were a nice color purple, not dark. And in the sky, I had taken the sun, and I had removed it, and then sewn it back on in a different position, which indicated that things had changed drastically in my life, but that the sun was still shining. So no, I don't think you need to use dark colors particularly. In fact, why? The sun is still shining no matter how we feel. Mm-hmm. Well, not always in Washington, but you know what I mean.
Rarely.
What do you think?
Well, those two paintings were painted during a very dark period of my life. So, I didn't use much in the way. The underpainting's very dark, which shows through in different areas, but I guess I wanted the message to come across that I was feeling, which was that I'm still here and there's still time to live the rest of my life the way, in some ways, doing the things that she wanted to do. And she was an artist as well.
You have some very hopeful turquoise in there.
Yeah.
I like that.
But still, the horizontal line also.
I don't know if I can get away from the horizontal lines. I've tried.
Well, I was going to say that the horizontal line is a rest.
Yes.
And and placing it out near the edges, even those vertical moments, the dark edges, placing it out to the edge of the canvas. It's not in the center. It's not active in the center of the canvas. It's subordinate to everything that's happening in the center. And so those dark moments, I think they do come through in those paintings, using horizontals.
Also, I think with the dripping paint, sometimes for me, is that feeling of, there's a little bit of guess, edginess or darkness to that.
Microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So they can hear you.
Becky, how? You have anything? You want to use this one?
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking more in terms of metaphors. You know, I don't know what kind of imagery you said you liked portraiture. So the face and showing the face. You know, and I'm just sitting here trying to imagine, because I don't do portraits, but I think a lot of times trying to show a certain uncertainty or ambiguity or the use of shadow, so that things aren't so clear, you know, and letting your uncertainty, and even if it's something very deeply sad that you're trying to depict. I mean, and maybe like lately, I mean, deeply sad about the situation in the world, most of the situations, and the planet, and the violence, you know. So if you want to sneak those into your work, you know, if it pisses you off, put it in there, you know. I mean, in some way.
Yeah, I think that I like just the idea of metaphor, and that the art elements and the materials can be metaphors for those feelings. So it wouldn't necessarily even have to be the dark colors, and but you know, and I think of Edvard Munch. You know, there's the Scream. There's a lot of bright colors in the Scream, but there's a really strong force perspective, and the horizon line's very high, and then you have this figure that's really confronting the viewer. And so thinking in terms of that, like Becky said, you know, in terms of, you know, that there's an uncertainty to a form that it doesn't necessarily hold together, maybe it comes apart in some way, or there's something that's confrontational. Those things can be, you know, using the art elements to communicate in that way. And thinking those things that would be very straight up and down and very orderly can sometimes be very calming and peaceful, but when things are in disarray, and so with that, then you could have a very bright painting, but that could be completely chaotic and unsettling.
Or the opposite. I mean, if you make it very geometrical and you know, it can be claustrophobic. In very bright colors, you can, you know, you can go many ways.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that reminds me that Alberto Giacometti's work is at the Seattle Art Museum right now, just thinking in terms of forms and figures. Some of you may not be familiar with Giacometti, but he would make these very attenuated, elongated figures that are compressed in time and space, and there's something very tragic about his figures. But you know, they might just be in bronze or plaster, his drawings, or charcoal. He'd paint with grays and neutrals, but not real heavy, deep blacks, you know, so. Fun question. I guess. Does anybody else have a question or comment for the artists, or just about this exhibition that we're in, this awesomeness? By the way, Sandra has one of her paintings on this wall right here, one of the faces, so. Anyone else? Do you guys have anything else you'd like to?
Thanks for inviting us. Yeah. Just thanks for inviting us to.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, somebody else has a question.
Yep, okay, I'm gonna pass.
Thanks. I'd just like to know a little bit more about your artistic heroes or heroines. Who floats your boat and inspires you?
I mentioned a few. Okay, I have a long list, but the short list would be starting with Caravaggio. Value has always been a big part of my work. More interested in value than almost anything else. After Caravaggio, Goya, There I'm getting my dark side. Leonard Baskin, who some of you might be familiar with, he's a very famous printmaker in the East that was a mentor to me for many years in my printmaking days. Let's see. Franz Klein, of course, I love him. He's the one artist that I would like to have a meal with. You know how they say, who would you like to have dinner with? Franz Klein. And maybe Alice Neal. I love her work. And Rick Bartow, who's sort of local and one of my dear heroes. Anybody else? Go for it.
Yeah, I'm just, excuse me. Gosh, it is a big list, and it changes over time. I'm actually looking at someone right now whose work I saw in England a couple of times, visits before, named Joan Erdly, and she was kind of a plein air painter in Scotland. And there's a Erdly, Eardley. I bought her book at a bookstore in England after I'd seen her work. And so things like that happen to me, and I'll just try to soak up and try to figure out why it's resonating with me and why this work is so compelling, whether it's the mark or the color or the, you know, what is about the content of the work. I love all the guys like Robert Rauschenberg that work with stuff, you know, Jasper Johns, all those folks. And I'm trying to think of the women too, because there's a lot of women like abstract expressionists. Of course, you have to love Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, in, you know, those women that led the way.
Everyone has to read the book, The Ninth Street Women.
Yeah, I read that book, yeah. And Eva Hess, I mean, she's probably my favorite in that book.
Do you know Cicely Brown?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. She lives in New York, but she's British. Yeah, I love her work. And there's just so many, and I'm spacing out. Of names. I'm losing my memory, I think. Yeah. So many. I mean, just any art book. You know, go to secondhand books or half-price books, and you go in the back where they have all the books that are like $1 or $2. They're trying to get rid of them, and there's art books back there. And just, you know, I come out with a bundle of them, and just learn. Friends of the library. Oh, okay. Yeah. Whatever. Yeah. Wherever you can find stuff. Yeah.
Janice, who are you looking at?
Well, so many, but I guess most recently I'm most inspired by Basquiat. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I love his work because it's so childlike, and I try to incorporate. Well, I did a workshop with my uncle, who's an artist in New York, and I'm inspired by his work, and that's one of the things he said, to paint like a child before you were afraid of what other people would think. So.
Anything else? Anyone else?
There's one more thing we could add to that, the people living and dead that we love. I find a lot of inspiration from primitive art. It's clarity, it's the purity of the message or whatever. It has a certain integrity that appeals to me, and I've collected a lot of it over the years, and I spend a lot of time just looking at it. It's a lot of sophisticated form and an intellectual thing about it that just grabs me every time I look at some simple thing that comes from the South Pacific or from Africa or from our own country that's ancient. Really.
So you're thinking of like indigenous
very much
work
so.
from other cultures. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because it's always bugged me when they say primitive art and they speak about indigenous people, I always found it was such an insult. And I'm so happy to hear you say that it's sophisticated, it's intelligent, and everything on that altar.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? I just saw the Elvis movie with my mother. Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For sitting up here. And thanks to everyone who's coming out this evening. I see a lot of my students here. That's good. Good job. Yes, and to anyone that's watching the live stream, this exhibition, and for those of you here in the gallery, this exhibition's open until the 18th of August. And our next artist talk is next Thursday, same time, same, I don't want to say same channel, it's not a channel anymore, but same time here in the gallery, and we will have, oh my gosh, I've completely drawn a blank of who's going to be here then. Okay, we have Jay Shepard, Jane Degenhardt, and Frank, thank you. Thank you. It's been a very long week. This is my second event this week in the gallery in the evening. So, all right. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for coming and sharing.